Good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up. It's such a glorious day outside, I have to admit. It's hard to be inside on Zoom, but I'm so glad to see everybody coming up. I can't see everybody at the same time that I see my picture. Oh, Callie sees the 1% free card. Okay, I'm going to figure this out some way, how to move the images around so that I can see my board. But today, I want to talk about liberating Buddhism a little bit. So, I think that a lot of people come to Buddhist practice or look for in Buddhist practice an end to their personal suffering. I certainly did. I started reading about Buddhism long before I ever began to sit or practice it. I was a teenager and I was reading about the beatniks. And so there was something really empowering about these adults criticizing the world the same way that I was criticizing it, finding the same things wrong with it. And their descriptions of Buddhism and the books they led me to imagine enlightenment as this great transcendental cotton candy land of super empowerment. Something like a cross between the ninja movies and the samurai movies that I like to watch, and knowing the answer to every question, never again having a moment's insecurity or uncertainty. And for, kind of a fat kid who could never find his tongue around girls, I'd be so stymied by attraction that I couldn't even look at them. Enlightenment really seemed like the ticket. And it takes a long time to interrogate that. I say all the time, because I heard it somewhere once, don't believe everything you think. And it's a pretty good rule, pretty good practice, for Buddhists particularly. The train of thought that blows through our thoughts, comes over the spinal telephone, is very often random. When I close my eyes in Zazen, I'm immediately catapulted into strange little movie scenes where characters are talking and discussing things, and it feels like I've come into just the center of a movie that has been playing for quite a while. It doesn't really make much sense. And we don't think that our thoughts are linked to our personality. And we don't really blame our personality very often for what's causing us trouble. But one of the things that the Buddha taught was that our self-awareness, that thing we call the self, is actually fluid. It's not a fixed entity. It doesn't relate to any organ, doesn't have a location, doesn't have a color, doesn't have a shape. And the good news that implies is that we are free to change or drop bad habits or alter ourselves. It's not that it's always easy, but we're free to do it. And in fact, that's one definition of nirvana, is being free in the next moment to choose something new, to be unbound, to be unimpeded. I have a little tattoo on my arm. I don't know if you can see it, that character. It means boundaryless. So, but curiously enough, the Buddhism that we've been attracted to in many cases is coming from the Middle Ages. And for many, many years, Buddhism found its security, certainly since the time of King Ashoka, the first Buddhist king in India. Buddhism sought its protection in the state and was very often turned to nationalistic purposes. Certainly true in Japan. there was a complete fascist movement in Buddhist circles, supporting the war, supporting, doing blessings over young kamikaze pilots. Suzuki Roshi was a priest during that time. So somehow there seems to be a contradiction between this agency of liberation that in itself may not be liberated. For instance, one of the things that we find is that when we're attached to kind of ethnic Buddhism, Buddhism that's very derivative of India, or Buddhism that's very derivative of Japan or Indonesia or Vietnam, we may be unintentionally absorbing a whole lot of ultra-conservative ancient practices that were really part of the accommodations that Buddhism had to make to survive as a practice. In Japan, it wasn't possible for a Sangha to maintain its integrity without being relegated by the state. And the Japanese have a word, the word for religion is matsuri. And the word for a government administration is matsuri goto. So they were very, very bound up, very close. So people don't always see the extent to which actual Buddhist practice is extremely radical. That the boundarylessness, the formlessness of Buddhist insight frees you from the state, from race, from caste, from all sorts of attachments that we make to our personality and identity. People like to identify with teams. It's kind of a way of enlarging the ego by attaching to something larger than yourself, but it's still based on your personality's preferences and identities and a whole bunch of subtle ways why you choose this team as opposed to that team, or why you choose this product as opposed to that product. But Buddhism actually transcends all of that. The original spirit of Buddhism is supporting positive, compassionate action and denying oppression. The two go hand in hand. And that spirit of compassionate action and resisting oppression needs to be continually refreshed. We tend to think that with just a few adjustments, the status quo will be just fine with Buddhism. We believe that our government system, our economic system are inevitable. And to the degree that we believe they're inevitable, we seek accommodation with them. Buddha was the first proponent of nonviolence. So I'm not suggesting that refusing to accommodate involves violent overthrow or repression or lining your enemies up on the Washington Monument and shooting them on television, as I'm often prone to imagine. The world is lucky I'm a priest. But it certainly sets nationalism and national goals and many political goals in a context in which the Buddha was far more radical. And we often forget that. Buddha demonstrated what he meant before he gave a lecture. If you read the Diamond Sutra, it begins by saying he was going to give a talk, and so he got up, he put on his hat, he took his begging bowl, and he went into town and he begged for his meal for that day. Then he came back, he washed his feet, he washed his bowl, he put his stuff away, then he sat down and then he talked. Well, what's important about that is that Buddha was living the life that he preached and that he practiced. And for about the first 500 years of Buddhist practice, the mantra was kind of the problems with desires, turn them off. was extremely renunciatory, but consistent. The Buddha did it. And all of his speeches and all of his talks came out of a life that exemplified his principles. He was open-minded. He admitted people of every caste. He admitted people of every gender. Although initially when he was asked to admit women, he refused. And he refused because he had practical reasons. He thought it would be very difficult. The society would not support it. People would suspect mischievous behavior. And the person who came to him was Ananda. And Ananda, we're told over and over again in the sutras and scriptures, was not enlightened. But Ananda went to the Buddha and he said, "Do you feel that a woman has the same spiritual potential as a man?" And the Buddha said, "Yes." And so from there was this opening, and he gradually came to allow women into the Sangha. And there were some accommodations. Women had slightly stricter rules than men did, but a number of those rules were to protect the women from men. A number of them were to protect the women from monks. And then there was a certain portion where the women had to show respect to the monks, which was the price tag for admission. But in that story, we see that Buddha was open-minded, he was open to reason, and that you didn't have to be enlightened to come up with a good idea. So, to the extent that we subordinate ourselves to the state, to our culture, to economic values, we're tying up a lot of energy that we can be using to liberate one another and ourselves and actually solve problems. By the time you've consumed most of your energy of your personal life just making a living and paying your taxes and doing the things you have to do, you don't have a whole lot left over to share. So as long as Buddhism's primary goal is subsumed inside national goals, it's just not going to work. It's never going to be met. Because the needs of the state will always serve as excuses or rationales for not pursuing liberation, not pursuing the principles of Buddhism. An enlightened person is a citizen of the world. An enlightened person is not Japanese or German or American or anything else. We have these tendrils, we have these karmic connections to our culture, but if you actually look, we know that Buddha nature is empty. It doesn't have the shape of any culture or state. It doesn't have any language. It's empty. It's formless. So if Buddhism is going to supply the world with what it needs, if it's going to be helpful, one of the things it has to look at is its own rigidities and its own enslavement. And it also has to look at what it can learn from the West. Wisdom and knowledge didn't start and stop in ancient Asia. It doesn't have to wear Tibetan robes or Vietnamese robes or Buddhist robes. It doesn't have to wear robes at all. It doesn't have to be monastic. The person in ancient India who was second only in intelligence to the Buddha was named Vimalakirti. It's what my lineage of Buddhist practice is called, Vimala Sangha. And he was a very rich man. He had servants, he had children, he had people that worked for him, he had business affairs, and he was famous for going anywhere where people gathered to preach the Dharma. He'd go to the racetrack, he'd go to the bars, he'd go wherever it was. And whether or not he was an actual person or not, we don't know. We know that there's a sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra, but he may have been an invention by the later Mahayana Buddhism, the second 500 years. The first 500 years, people were saying the problems with desire, turn them off. And they practiced all sorts of strict renunciations. In fact, they practiced the same kind of renunciations that dropped the Buddha into a gutter on the verge of death until he was rescued by a milkmaid who gave him the offering she was carrying to the temple. And he realized on the middle path he had to acknowledge his body and his needs. So we need to be careful when we study the ancient systems of India or China or Japan or Vietnam, Indonesia. We need to be careful that we don't also adopt basically Middle Age philosophies and practices, because the world has expanded. And one of the great ways in which the world has expanded was through Western Enlightenment, the scientific revolution and expansion in the 1400s. So let's just, for the sake of anything else, let's just call it modernism for a minute. Because modernism has really helped Buddhism. And there's a school of Buddhism, which I feel pretty aligned with, which is called engaged Buddhism. And engaged Buddhism is trying to learn from modernism. It's a tricky dance, as I'll show you in a minute. I'm going to just read you a little thing. There are 5 conditions that have provided the matrix within which a new Buddhism has come into being. These 5 conditions are laws that provide some protection from the state. A religion which was subservient to the state had no protection from the demands of the state. But religions in Western societies do. They have the state of law which can protect them from oppression, from unfair taxation, from imprisonment for their values. The humanistic Enlightenment, which encouraged individual intellectual inquiry. This was the gist of the scientific revolution. This is where Galileo and Copernicus and Newton and Descartes and Einstein came from. This was the assertion that your personal intelligence is equal to an objective examination of the world around you. And this is the supposition that's underlied all scientific achievement. Buddhism's not immune from it. The third one is modern communication. It becomes very hard to stay in the Middle Ages when you can plug in and you can see how people are living in other places. You can see other political systems. You can see other economic systems. You can examine them for yourself with the individual intellectual capacity that you have, which Western Enlightenment supported. Relative global peace. Sometimes that feels like a fiction, but compared to the world wars, compared to the Middle Ages in which the leading cause of death was murder, there have been books written about the relative peace of the modern age, the modern century. And so that's obviously played to Buddhism as well. There was a period in China for 300 years when Buddhism was flourishing, where monasteries were being built a day's walk apart. And families would be involved in projects building great stupas and temples that might take 300 or 400 years to build, like the great cathedrals. And so there was a kind of social stability where your great-grandfather and your grandfather and your father and the sons were all dedicated to the same task. Those are benefits of peace, for instance. And finally, there's a global economy. There's a global economy which allows lots of people to participate in whatever way they can. Computers have facilitated that. So now these things are also, not everybody agrees with this, because if I turn these 5 things, laws, humanistic enlightenment, independent intellectual inquiry, modern communications, relative global modernism, they can be restated as Individualism, intellectualism, technology, Western political hegemony, and material consumerism. Not all so good. Not all so popular. So what's the dividing line? What rescues them? Or what's the tipping point? So there seem to be 7 or 8 conditions that people have agreed upon as a framework for engaged Buddhism. And I'm going to read them because they're useful. It's what I want to talk about. The first is action in society rather than reliance upon meditation and devotion alone. So this goes back to my opening remarks. I think a lot of people come to Buddhism seeking surcease from their personal suffering. And I know I've been criticized sometimes in these Dharma talks talking about politics, and people have reacted as if politics are not spiritual. I don't know what world they live in. If politics is the expression of compassion and fairness and equality of opportunity, how can that not be a spiritual issue? It doesn't have to involve anger, doesn't have to involve hatred, it doesn't have to involve prejudice. But to divide the world as if there's spirit and matter, as if there's stuff that's spiritual and there's stuff that's not, is just a mental pet. It's not a fact. If everything comes from primordial energy, Buddha nature, which is formless, continually generating all the things of the world, including the non-visible, feelings, impulses, sensation, and consciousness, there are no dividing lines. It's the way you do anything that will determine whether it's spiritual or not. If you pursue politics for personal aggrandizement or to gain personal power to oppress others, it's not spiritual. If you pursue politics like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., it is spiritual. So let's be careful how we draw lines. So action in society rather than reliance on meditation and devotion. In other words, your enlightenment is not a solo act. You become enlightened to make yourself more useful to the world, to stop suffering in the world. This was the Buddha's great drama. This was the big story he wants to enlist us in. A new morality that encompasses nonviolence and ecological awareness rather than just monasticism. I said earlier that the first 500 years of Buddhist practice were ascetic and renunciation. Well, in the second, they said the problem was desire. Stop them. In the second 500 years, people came forward and they said, oh no, that's not the problem. The problem is not desire. Turn them on. And there was a huge flowering of crafts, artists, yogins, shamans, musicians, painters, all moving out and expressing their insight through these various disciplines. Because somebody realized if you were simply a monastic practice, you were not saving the world. You were saving yourself and people who already thought alike. So instead of spending all your time suppressing emotion and feelings, turn them on and guide them. Nobody criticizes a whitewater river for being a river, but you can learn to ride a kayak on it. You can learn to use that energy for a positive end. And it seemed a lot more fruitful in the next 500 years to create a larger playing field where you could reach more people if the goal was to save all beings. New forms of community, exploiting the potentiality of new technology and mass media. This is one. There are many people showing up here that I don't know, that I've never met. I get calls from Ireland. I get some from Europe. This is a reaching out of some kind. So I could sit in my house, especially in the pandemic, and let the one person a month who walked up the road in a mask in, or I can try to engender a conversation and share some ideas that people will find useful and they might pick up and mimic or reinvent on their own. And that would not be possible without mass communication. So I can't just say that the computer is bad or good. Even Facebook, which has had all this mischief and all this terrible activity associated with it and supporting really division and the overthrow of the government, if we're not careful, is the vehicle by which I'm talking to you today. So we have to be careful. Interreligious dialogue and a willingness to find followers among other faiths. You know, very often, even in Buddhist communities, there are many sects of Buddhism. And there are Buddhist bookstores which will only print the writings of their teacher. Well, where's that at? That's not very open-minded. That's not leaving us fluid. That's not leaving us to take advantage of the insights and discoveries other sects have made. You know, during the time when when Romans were feeding Christians to the lions, Buddhism had a very highly developed public debating system. The Tibetans still teach this way. Geshes, who are the equivalent of PhDs, they have public debates that are attended, and everybody's point of view has to be clearly expressed and heard and then refuted. And that's part of what has kept Buddhism as a vibrant, interactive, kind of growing community, because it's not closed off to new ideas. That's an engagement. That dialogue doesn't have to stay within the Buddhist community itself. We can engage Christians, Jews, Muslims, Jains, Wiccans. It doesn't matter. The Buddha once said to his followers, they were upset because somebody was criticizing him. And he said, please don't be angry when somebody criticizes me. That's going to color your mind. It's going to make you less able to think clearly about whether what they're saying about me is right. If what they're saying about me is right, accept it and change. And if what they're saying about me is wrong, defend it. But don't muddy the water with anger. A concern for Mother Earth and respect for the wild. Wilderness is the clearest expression of Buddha nature that we have. Wild means self-organized for its own purposes. A fox doesn't exist for us. An oak tree doesn't exist for us. Clouds don't exist for us. They exist for their own purposes. And the interaction is the greatest example that we have of Buddha mind writ large on a big field. So the idea that we could have any kind of a culture on a degraded and impoverished earth is another fiction. I once did the audiobook for Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. No, maybe it was his second book. I think it was called Destruction. It was about the collapse of ancient and modern societies. And one of the points that he observed is that you could take a map of the world, and if you drew the greatest environmental crises onto that map, if you sketched in those areas where the greatest environmental struggle was taking place, and then you sketched in where the greatest political violence was taking place, they were the same. One of the things that many people don't know about the Rwandan genocide is that Rwanda had become so overpopulated and so degraded that gardens had fallen from an acre or 2 acres down to small plots, and that during the massacres, Hutus were not just killing Tutsis. Hutus were killing Hutus because anybody you killed had a goat or had a pair of sneakers or had something that you didn't have. And in exactly the same way that when you overcrowd rats in a small area, they turn on one another. That's what happens in environmentally degraded areas. And if you look at places like Afghanistan, where the forests were cut away centuries ago, the topsoil has washed away. One of the reasons those nations are so volatile is because life is so difficult. People are living on the edge. And we Americans have had the bonus of stealing an uninhabited country. And there was so much wealth here that we're still living off it, but it's tightening up. And global warming is certainly exacerbating drought and flood and fire and eventually famine. So any practice of liberating Buddhism has to include ecological awareness, worship of Mother Earth, and the wild. A search for a new economics, at least to abate destruction. I've been reading a book by 2 UN economists, and it's really startling because what they assert is that the study of economics in itself is designed to defend great wealth. That once upon a time when kings and princes ran everything, some people were rich and some people were poor. Nobody really knew the difference. I mean, not that they didn't know if they were rich or poor, but they didn't know how it came about. So starting in the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the middle class, people began to rise from poverty into the middle class, into wealth, and the mechanism of accreting wealth became public, became known, and became visible. And so the divine right of kings no longer held sway. You couldn't just say, well, God ordained me to rule. So what was called upon was a new theoretical explanation of this. And that theoretical explanation was economics. And what these fellows are pointing out is that economics pretends to be a science like physics, but it's not. It's full of variables. It's full of nonsense. And its function is to protect wealth. Its function is to ensure inequality. Now, I haven't read enough to know that this is true, but these 2 fellows, they're Americans, they're prize winners, they're well-regarded economists, and they're basically pulling the cover off this study. And when you look at it, you think, yeah, well, what has economy done? What has economics done to ensure economic equality in America? Right now, the United States has the greatest division between rich and poor of any country on earth, greater than Saudi Arabia. There's a country ruled by the laws of economics, the supposed laws. So I'm inclined to believe this book. I'm still reading it and studying it. So a new economics, for instance, would be an economics that doesn't count the raw materials of the earth for nothing. It would attribute costs to taking out the coal, to extracting the gas, to extracting the water, to extracting food, to extracting fruit. All these things have a cost, but economics doesn't always equate them or write them into the equation. Same thing for getting rid of the waste. In some countries in the world, a manufacturer of a television is obligated to take the television back so that they can take the mercury out of the old tubes. We send our computers to China, where the destruction of them causes cancer among impoverished Chinese peasants who are stripping them for copper and burning off the plastic and breathing noxious fumes. Well, we're responsible. To the extent that we buy computers, We should be responsible for their destruction when they're not good anymore. So the consumer can't do that. So the price, the cost of getting rid of it should be in the cost of purchase. Same thing for chemicals that treat there are 100,000 chemicals a year added into the environment. In Europe, those chemicals are subjected to something called the precautionary principle. The manufacturer has to prove they're safe. In America, you have to prove they're harmful. Well, how can you do that as a citizen? So we need an economic system that will actually take account of what we're destroying and the harms that we're causing and the illness that results from spreading toxins around. 100,000 chemicals a year. And maybe they test one or they test them all by themselves, but they don't test them in concurrence. When my sister died of cancer, I'd complained to her for years that her well water just stunk. And after she died, we found out that 17 people in her community had died of cancer. And then I saw that film with Jan.12 about this chemical company dumping crap in the woods that soaked down into the well water. You know, after the fact, it's too late. So we need an economic system that will take care of those things. A gender-inclusive approach. Not only men and women, but LGBTQ people, transgender people. All of these people have Buddha nature. All of these people are fully human. And so to create a system that doesn't include them is like going back to a Middle Ages view of humankind. Basically, you know, dualistic, like the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all based on contradictions and dualities, good and evil. The twain never meet. Buddhism is not a duality like that. Buddha nature is a universal common denominator. It's quite different. And finally, a concern with institutional as well as personal reform. Institutional as well as personal reform. We're seeing it right now. The Congress is debating about protecting the right to vote. We're seeing an open-air, broad daylight approach to rigging the next elections, choosing the people who count the votes by partisan interests. Black citizens are still not guaranteed their right to vote. They used to be. The Supreme Court, up until 2013, the Voting Rights Bill, which Lyndon Johnson passed, not only guaranteed them the right to vote, but it guaranteed them that southern states with a history of slavery could not institute new voting procedures without getting clearance from the federal government. And in 2013, the Supreme Court threw that out, and bingo, immediately, the southern states began repressing the vote, suppressing the vote. So these are institutional reforms, and no amount of personal enlightenment is going to solve those problems. If we don't include people of color in our concerns, we're never going to have a country at peace. If we don't include economic division in our concerns, we're never going to have a country at peace. If we don't bring people like the Sackler family, who single-handedly started the opioid addiction crisis in the United States, if they're not held responsible, we're never going to have a country at peace. If we don't have full employment, we're not going to have a country at peace. So there are powerful conservative tendencies within Buddhism. We have to take them on. We have to expose them to daylight. It's not the Middle Ages. They're present and they're closely linked to many of the cultures that we emulate. And many of the cultures where we confuse the cultural expression with Buddhist practice. My lineage is Zen. So, man, I love tatami mats. I love my black cushions. I love, that look I grew up with associating with Zen. But there's also a lot of authoritarianism in Japanese culture. There's a lot of hierarchy. And Americans suck that stuff in like a sponge. And before long, we're all looking up at the Roshi and nobody's challenging the Roshi. And he or she is going on until they get in trouble. And there's rarely a Buddhist community you can point to where one of the leaders has not been accused of some malfeasance, inappropriate sex, too much drinking, misappropriating the money. The real point is that none of these traditions, India, China, Japan, Tibet, Indonesia, are more important than Buddhism itself. It's the teachings of the Buddha that are gold. And the teachings of the Buddha need Western enlightenment as much as we need Buddhism. A lot of people study Buddhism because they like it because it's gentle and it's mindful, and they seek a kind of open-minded something, I don't know, preserving their own equanimity. But that's not what the Buddha did. The Buddha was a radical. He was a gentle radical, but he was a radical. He didn't stand for status. He didn't stand for wealth. He didn't stand for privileges of caste or gender at all. And neither should we. That's not a spiritual understanding. Many Westerners are so alienated from political process and the mischief in it that they've given up on it. Oh, we can't afford to do that. There's only one world. We're living in it. And if our Buddhism is going to be worth anything, it's going to be worth taking on the political process as well. And if you do it with a Buddhist perspective, you're not going to be angry. You're not going to blame your opponents. You're not going to cast aspersions on them. You're not going to lie. And people will come to trust you. So harmony is never achieved by sameness. Harmony is the relationship between notes, right? It's not just one note. It's not just the Zen line or the Vipassana line or the Chan line. So we need open-hearted and open-ended discussion and analysis and debate to discover what's relevant, what's outmoded, and what isn't. The tradition of free speech has not taken hold in much of the Buddhist world, where the word of the Roshi is the last word and is often never challenged. So my assertion is that the West has much to learn from Buddhism, and Buddhism has much to learn from the West. Here's a nice quote from David Brazier's book called The New Buddhism. Buddhism has flourished precisely in times of intellectual ferment. Buddhism in India developed a tradition of logic and debate, while Europeans were still feeding each other to the lions. It's axiomatic to this tradition that the other party's argument be respected and allowed to be heard clearly. The trouble is that a mythology has spread which suggests that enlightened people know everything and can never be gainsaid. It's just nonsense. You're going to have the same problems as an enlightened person that you had when you began your study, but you're going to have better tools to deal with them, and you're going to know how to deal with it. It's not like when you save someone from drowning, you drain the ocean. And when you save someone from not suffering, but from the results of suffering, you're not ending suffering. You're learning how to contain it and deal with it. Western enlightenment without something like Buddhist enlightenment all too easily becomes an alienating, antisocial, dog-eat-dog wilderness in which each privatized individual fights for his or her personal survival, equipped only with selfish concern. The Buddhist enlightenment, Without something like the Western Enlightenment, all too easily becomes an oppressive orthodoxy in which no one is allowed to think for him or herself, and harmony is achieved by suppressing diversity rather than by capitalizing on creativity. We don't want to allow principles of no mind to degenerate into mindlessness. Something to think about. I think that's enough for today. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Thank you all very much for coming today. I'll see you next time.